Hello, and welcome to the BibleSourceText History Podcast. I want to take some time to just explain what it is that this podcast is going to be. Really, what I want to do here is to just work through the Bible chapter by chapter and analyze it as a historical document. My educational background is actually in history and not theology, though certainly we're going to be discussing some theology here. But I'm really more interested in the historical context as well as the linguistic decisions that have been made in translating these documents. Why were specific words chosen to be translated certain ways. We're going to be drawing, connections between surrounding cultures and trying to understand exactly what it was this text was meant to say. As I am a Christian, we're going to be coming at this with a Christian perspective, but I would also hope that even if you're not a Christian, you can still get something out of this, even if it's just learning more about ancient history. The Bible's obviously influential on historical and current culture, and so it is definitely valuable to know a little bit about where that comes from. The thing we really have to remember is that the Bible's written in an entirely different context than any of us live in today, and making connections to the culture of the authors is important to understanding what they wanted to say. There's a sense that this podcast is sort of anti-postmodern. We're not really concerned as much with how people later have interpreted the text, but more what the original authors wanted to communicate. The other thing to remember, especially if you're not familiar with the Bible, is just simply that the Bible's not a single text. It's a collection of texts written by hundreds of different authors over several centuries and then compiled together later. The Bible's a lot less like a movie, and it's more like a series of vignettes that nonetheless tell a cohesive story all the way across. The Bible covers across many different genres. There are books that are written like myth, and I don't mean to say that myth in a negative sense, not to imply that it's not true or there's not truth to it, but it follows the form of other ancient mythology. There are texts that are just straightforward history texts, the history of Israel or the history of the early church. There's poetry, songs. The book of Esther kind of is written like an ancient novella almost. There is prophecy, which is its own whole subgenre at the time. There is the ancient, Israelite covenants, which follows the pattern of other ancient covenants. And then there are the epistles, which are letters between an apostle and a specific church. And so understanding all of those genres is important to understanding, again, what the author's intent is. So obviously, we'll start with going through the books of the Old Testament. We'll go, as I said, go chapter by chapter. The important thing to remember about the Old Testament, it is an ancient Near Eastern source. And so we can gain some insight by drawing comparisons to other Mesopotamian sources, other Egyptian sources, for the later Persian sources. These were other societies that the Israelites had contact with, that by drawing comparisons that we can kind of understand what the Israelites were trying to say. When we get to the New Testament, the New Testament is written, it very much comes out of a Jewish context. But yet at the same time, it's also universal. The message is supposed to be for everyone. And so there's a very real sense where you have to understand first century Jewish theology to understand first century Christian theology. And especially when it comes to word choice by the translators and word choice by the author. Why did they say this specific word? Some of the things written in the New Testament are intended to be interpreted as fulfillments of elements of Jewish theology. Some are meant to be reactions to open questions in Jewish theology or statements by other Jewish theologians. So it's important to draw those kinds of connections. The New Testament's also written very much in an imperial context. We're talking about a small fringe religious group that was at odds with the Roman Empire, at least initially. Eventually that changes, but that's a story for a different day. The context that Christianity is founded in is that the first century Jews living in Judea expected deliverance from Rome. They expected the restoration of David's kingdom. Jesus establishes the kingdom of God, Christianity, instead, and how that looks different from what was expected. That is a major part of understanding the New Testament. I also think that there's to some degree, it's necessary to understand Gnostic theology. They were important in the overall context of the founding of Christianity. There were Jewish Gnostics and Christian Gnostics. Gnosticism itself was its own whole religious system, but was also connected to these other religious systems. And there are sections of the Bible that are straightforward reactions to Gnostic theology. And so we will talk about that. Now, once we talk about the Old and New Testament, I do want to take some time. This is way down the line, but I plan to eventually talk about the Apocrypha as well. This is a point of contention between Protestants and Catholic and Orthodox Christians because, we Protestants do not use the Apocrypha. We do not include that in our Bible. Catholic and Orthodox Christians do. What that really boils down to is different sets of ancient texts. The Masoretic text versus the Septuagint being two major, versions of the Old Testament. The Septuagint included the Apocrypha, the Masoretic text did not. But neither of these sets of texts are really the original, and historians and textual scholars have debated which one's closer to the original. For what it's worth, Martin Luther considered the Apocrypha not to be scriptural, but still to be valuable for Christians to study. So I think it's worth, once we cover the Old and New Testaments, to go into the Apocrypha as well. And eventually I want to talk about other early Christian writers, what Catholic theologians would refer to as the Church Fathers or the patristic writings. Excuse me. These were not considered part of the scriptures, but they're part of the sacred tradition in Catholic and Orthodox circles. But again, to us Protestants, though we may not consider them authoritative, they give insight into early Christian practices and early doctrines. One final point for this introduction video, I will be using mostly the New American Standard Version, unless there is some reason why not to. I find it to be easy to read and yet less interpretive than maybe the less literal translations that are the easiest to read. I find it to be a good balanced version. When it really comes down to it, it doesn't matter much, and again, maybe that could be a topic for a future episode, that what is the difference between these different translations, but that's for way down the line. So thank you if you're still listening thus far. I'm looking forward to working through the Bible and working to understand it, and I hope that you can join me for this journey. Thank you.